Hello and welcome to the kickoff event for Ashland Chautauqua's Chautauqua Conversations. When the pandemic hit, we had to postpone our summer 2020 in times of war theme for a live event, but we decided it would be interesting to create some virtual events so that you could enjoy some Chautauqua programming throughout the winter and into the spring. So tonight, we're going to be working with a panel of our living history pioneers, and they will talk to us about the history of Chautauqua. And they're going to tell you some stories now, but we're also going to ask that you send your questions to us either by email at info@Ashland Chautauqua, or post something on our Chautauqua Facebook page. Find us there and like us. And then we're going to meet again on November 19th with these same respected scholar performers and have a live Q&A session. So be thinking of your questions, jot them down, and send them to us between now and November 19th. Just a little history about Ashland Chautauqua. We have been doing Chautauqua in our small town in north central Ohio for 20 years. And we started as a host for Ohio Humanities Ohio Chautauqua back in 2000, and they brought the tent to town and we set it up in Freer Field, and we hosted that Chautauqua for 3 years, and then we branched out on our own and created our own independent Chautauqua. And while we were doing that, we transitioned to no longer using the tent, but to working with a beautiful band shell in our community. And none of this 20 years would have been possible without incredible organizations supporting us along the way. So we have a partnership with Ashland Main Street, and they help us do what we do. And we also have a great relationship with the Ashland Convention and Visitors Bureau. But we get funding with larger state organizations. Ohio Humanities and the Ohio Arts Council funded us with grants so that we could bring you this virtual programming. And the technical aspect, we give a huge thank you to Ashland University for helping us pull off these virtual events. So our format is that you're going to watch this recording, and we're going to give you about a 2-week time to do that. And then you want to watch for an email or check our website or check Facebook for an invitation to an Eventbrite link where you can register for that live Zoom session on November 19th. Register and you will get the Zoom link the day before, and you can come back and join these gentlemen and listen to their stories and ask some questions. Now, the program tonight we're going to do in kind of 4 chunks. We're going to start with part 1, which will be about the inspiration for Chautauqua. And then part 2 will be about the formation of humanities Chautauquas, where living history was brought to life. And then the third section will be these gentlemen sharing their stories of touring together in the Great Plains Chautauqua Society tour that happened for several years. And then our last section will be on what they and others have done to keep things moving forward after the Great Plains Chautauqua ended. I'm Delisa Randall Griffiths, and I'm the chair of our Chautauqua Planning Committee. And I'm going to let these gentlemen introduce themselves, but the one thing I can tell you, they share many things in common, but one thing is that they are all for getting ready to celebrate a 30th anniversary of touring together as part of the troupe for the Great Plains Chautauqua Society. So I will let you introduce yourself, and we'll start with George.
All right. I joined the Great Plains Chautauqua in 1986, before it was even the Great Plains Chautauqua Society. I portrayed a missionary. It was not too much fun. The next year, though, I portrayed Henry Adams, the great historian of the United States. He was a medievalist as well as an Americanist, and he always liked to compare and contrast Middle Ages and modern ages, men and women. He said about women that one competent woman was worth 10 men, and one incompetent woman was worth 5 men. Well, from there I went on to do Herman Melville, Mark Twain, and about a half a dozen others, and have been to Ashland doing Mark Twain, Dr. Seuss, and Herman Melville, and with a little bit of luck, will come as the author of All Quiet on the Western Front.
Okay, Charles?
I joined the Great Plains Chautauqua in the summer of 1991 in the series Writers of the American Renaissance, playing Frederick Douglass. Did him for 3 years. Then the Gilded Age Chautauqua brought me the character of W.E.B. Du Bois, the man who had intimidated me for years, and I finally got enough nerve to attempt him. Then I did 4 years worth of Du Bois's nemesis, the great Booker T. Washington, From Sea to Shining Sea. And the final 5 years was with York, who traveled with the Lewis and Clark expedition from 1893 to 07.
My name is Kevin Radaker, and I was with the Great Plains Chautauqua in 1991, 92, and 93 with the American Renaissance Chautauqua. And I played Henry David Thoreau, the great American naturalist, transcendentalist, philosopher. In 2009, I developed C.S. Lewis, the well-known Christian apologist and fiction writer. I've offered 70 or 80 shows as him. And in 2016, just 4 years ago, I developed Winston Churchill. I obviously don't have this beard when I'm portraying him. And if luck serves, I'll be portraying him this coming summer during the In Times of War Chautauqua in Ashland. I have offered my Thoreau in Ashland in the past, and just a few years back, I offered my C.S. Lewis as well.
I'm Doug Watson. I joined Great Plains Chautauqua in 1991 to portray the author Nathaniel Hawthorne, who on the Chautauqua circuit was perhaps most memorably remembered as receiving a question from a 7-year-old girl who wondered why he was so sad. I don't know that I ever answered that question sufficiently. After the American Renaissance series, I portrayed Stephen Crane for several summers in the Gilded Age series, and then assumed the character of Will Rogers. I got the opportunity to present Will Rogers last summer in Ashland, and it's been a long journey with Will, but a very enjoyable one. So my experience with characters is not as broad as someone like George or Charles, for sure. But I think all of us have been in some ways remade by the people that we presume to be.
So we're going to start with that first part, and we're going to hear from these gentlemen about what were the inspirations for the thing that we call Chautauqua. It didn't come out of nowhere. It came from some very concrete things that had taken place in our country. So I'll let you talk a little bit about what you know about the inspiration.
Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Chautauqua Institution as it began in 1873, 1874. But, I think in some ways it's fair to say that this idea probably began back with the agora in ancient Greece, when community people came together to talk about ideas and how they got along with one another. Now, the idea of the Chautauqua Institution as it emerged in New York in the 1870s was on the heels of a civil war that had torn our country apart. And there were people who wanted some ways to put it back together. It was also a time of camp meetings when a lot of people thought emotions of religion might solve that. But Bishop John Hale Vincent and Lewis Miller, who were both good Methodists, believed that coming together should be a little more rational than some of the tent meetings had seemed to be. And so they set up the Chautauqua movement. They said, and this is very religious, to enlarge the recognition of the word and to become an international center, really, of morals, and to teach the practical application of the word. Now, I'm quoting in part of this from a book that Vincent published in 1885. This was only 10 years after the idea of the institution had begun. So he's probably both optimistic and idealistic at this point, but they have accomplished a good deal. Vincent said, we want a message and a mission both. We want to exalt education, to teach that life is all one. The home, the pulpit, the school, and the shop can come together in a single vision of moral goodness. And then when he talks about universal education, he points out that this doesn't just happen in colleges. In fact, he says Chautauqua is a sort of everyday college that brings the classes of society together in mutual respect for moral living. Well, they set up several vehicles for this, including book subscriptions for people who lived away from the institution all over the United States, the possibility of earning a high school diploma by reading some of those books and taking exams. By 1885, again, 10 years after, there were at least 35 or 40 different camps or parks or pavilions that had been set up in different communities, some of them as far away as South Africa, to try to hold to the idea of the Chautauqua movement, this bringing together to learn. There were a lot of farm ladies out in the Midwest, Nebraska, Kansas, who had subscribed to the books, read some of them, taken the exams, maybe even earned a high school diploma in a way that they couldn't have any other way. And so as the time goes by quickly, they began to expand geographically, and you get something called the Circuit Chautauqua for the purposes of really both education and pretty soon entertainment in order to bring people to these. They pack some of these ideas and people with them on trains and take them along with tents across the country, where they show up and do maybe a week or 2 weeks or maybe even more of programs to entertain people in small towns and people coming in to camp out for the time, bring their children to do a short drama, take classes, and probably sing a lot of hymns, be my guess. But all of this is to say there was an idea and there was a lot of energy that preceded what we began to do out of the idea that was born back on the Great Plains.
So that gives us the history of the name.
Maybe a century later.
And we understand how that gets connected to an Ashland Chautauqua happening in Ohio. I know others of you have ideas of other ways that there might have been inspirations. So tell us what else you think was going on that might have led to this performance of history that we know of today.
Well, I once did an interview with the late, great Everett C. Albers, who created the Great Plains Chautauqua, and I was asking him about that. And he said he got the idea from two sources to have performers perform in character, historical characters. One was the Steve Allen show, Meeting of the Minds, and Steve Allen gathered guests around a dinner table. As I remember, I can remember seeing it many years ago. Frederick Douglass, Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun, Plato, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Karl Marx. And it was called A Meeting of the Minds. And Everett liked that idea. And that was one way. There was another professor at the University of Minnesota by the name of Morris K. Sibley, a political science professor. And he would teach a certain class in a large bond. And even though he might have 30 or 40 students to sign up for the class, it got so that he would have several hundred people coming in to see him perform historical characters doing first-person historical interpretation. So those were two sources that Everett said inspired him to create the one-person historical interpretation.
Now, Kevin, I know you have a story about the Chautauqua institution. So share with us your memory of that.
Well, yes, as we heard Doug mention, Chautauqua started in Chautauqua, New York, which is in extreme southwestern New York State. And coincidentally, I was born and raised in Warren, Pennsylvania, which is just over the border from Jamestown, New York, which is right next door, to Chautauqua, New York. So I can remember as a boy, my parents taking me to Chautauqua and listening to musical artists and hearing speakers. My mother was a musician, so she loved for us to go up there and hear some world-renowned musicians. I was 9, 10, 11 years old. And they're very good memories. I remember loving the music, being so impressed with various speakers that I heard. And little did I know that I would eventually be involved in the modern day form of Chautauqua that we're talking about tonight.
And I know some of you probably have other things that you did in your life prior to Chautauqua that you see as sort of personal inspirations to how you got there. So were there other examples of work you had done or other things that helped shape how you became a Chautauquan?
This is George. I taught at the University of North Dakota for a number of years. And a colleague once said, "We're going out to Marmarth, North Dakota." I said, "Where is that?" He said, "It's the last town in western North Dakota. A couple more miles and you're in Montana. And we're going to Chautauqua." "Never heard of it," I said. He said, "Well, just come along." I wasn't sure how to spell it or see it or pronounce it. But when I got to the grounds where the tent was pitched in Marmarth, there was nobody around. There were only about 50 people in the whole town. And I thought, this is not going to go very good. I knew there was a program that evening and went and just sat in the chair and chatted with people in the tent. And it began to fill. There were 200 people before the program started. Farmers drove 70 miles to come to see this. I thought, this will be interesting. The program went along. The character spoke his lines and then answered questions. And I have to admit that though my students were good students, these farmers asked better questions. And they weren't asking for the exam. They weren't asking for a grade. They just wanted to know. And they asked wonderful questions. I thought, I got to figure out how to do this and bring it back to the classroom. I never had the courage to act in character in the classroom. I was never on the stage in my life. It terrified me. But there was something about those questions that wouldn't let me go. And I thought if Chautauqua can teach people how to ask questions, it's worth looking into. And that was the beginning for me.
What helped me was I was an actor in college, and my mentor at Penn State, where I received my PhD and graduated in 1987, just 3 years before I tried out for the Great Plains. My mentor, Bob Burkholder, a transcendentalist scholar at Penn State, heard about the Great Plains Chautauqua opportunity. If it had not been for Bob calling me one day and saying, "I think you should try out for this. I know that you portrayed Thoreau when you were in college in 1977, and I think you should try out for this." So that was very fortunate for me that Bob had come to know me well enough to know that I had been an actor in college, and I had played Thoreau in college in the play The Night Thoreau Spent in Jail, which was the most often produced play, as I understand it, in the 1970s, amateur production around the country. So Thoreau's fame, his popularity, lasted well into the 70s, and I benefited from that.
I spent my last year in the military, in the Army, in New York City at Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn. And there was a black theater company in Harlem called National Black Theater, NBT, under the leadership of the late, great Dr. Barbara Ann Tier. And I would go and just hang out with them when I had nothing else to do. And it was a nice place to go. And I'd never been to New York City before. So for a whole year, I did that. And when I came back to school at the University of Texas at Austin, I was taking an Afro-American Studies multicultural education course taught by Professor Geneva Gay. And Geneva wanted us to teach the book Man, Child, and the Promised Land. And we said, well, how do we do that curriculum, Geneva? And so she looked at us. She said, well, that's up to you. And I'll never forget, Paula Poindexter, now Professor Poindexter in the journalism department at UT, said, I know, let's do a play. And we put together a play and presented it to the class and then to the campus and then to the community. And we formed our theater, the Afro-American Players, in '72, and we are still together. And so when I went to graduate school in the place where you did your master's, Kevin, at Purdue University, Professor Gordon Mark gave me a call one day, and he said that he had seen an announcement for a conference called Culture Under Canvas, and it was being done at the College of St. Catherine. He was from Minnesota and knew the college, and he said, well, why don't you contact them? So I did, and we worked it out, and I came up, and the very last day of the conference, I passed this table, and there were all of these brochures, and I pulled one corner out, and that was the call for scholars for the American Renaissance, and Frederick Douglass was one of those characters, and that's how I got started doing Chautauqua.
Listening to all this makes me realize how accidental it was that I ever got into this at all. I had a bit part in a play in high school. And when I was working on my master's degree, my wife, who was then my fiance, was taking a drama class in which she had to produce a play. And rather than have to audition people, she drafted me and my cousin, who was my age, to play the two parts of Jerry and Peter in the zoo story. So Jerry was probably the only dramatic part I'd ever presented before I began Chautauqua. I had taught American literature for a decade or so, and felt like I knew some of the people who I would meet in the American Renaissance tour, but I never knew I'd know them quite so well.
What is the foundation? What were the inspirations? But we do know for our second part of this that there was a point where this idea of creating what we call the modern Chautauqua came about through the National Endowment for the Humanities. So George is going to give us a little bit of background, because he was there and involved in a lot of it, about how things got started in the 70s and 80s.
Well, things got started with the decline of the old circuit Chautauquas. Fewer and fewer people came to the tents from town to town. In order to bring in larger crowds, they did more and more entertainment. And the more entertainment they did, the fewer people came to the programs. They were looking for education in times before, and the less education there was less interest. Then when the National Endowment for the Humanities was established, they were directed in every state of the Union to carry on programs for the humanities and public interest and public affairs. Here's the history behind current political issues and the philosophy of the law and of the republic and so on. So they were interested in one very important humanities quality, and that is not to tell the truth, not to preach from the pulpit or a humanities platform, but to generate good questions by presenting many views that listeners could compare and contrast. And we had a program called American Visions, and Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Abigail Adams went out. I went out as Henry Adams, the historian, in an old-fashioned summer straw hat. And I introduced the programs. I talked a little bit about medieval history and how American history sometimes didn't compare to the beautiful cathedrals of the Middle Ages. Certainly men didn't compare to women in their intelligence. Well, this generated a little interest and antagonism in the audience. And then I introduced Thomas Jefferson. He came up and gave his vision of a wonderful agrarian America. Farmers were the people blessed by God. If ever God had a chosen people, it was farmers. And next night, Alexander Hamilton came up and he described how America could become a great commercial and industrial republic. And the third night, I introduced Adams' great-grandmother, and Abigail gave her presentation. The question came later from an audience member who said, you know, the first night, I knew I was Jeffersonian. What beautiful images and what a great vision for America he gave. But then the second night, Alexander Hamilton came, and I thought, Jefferson is just a romantic. This guy's real. This is the real vision of America. And so I know that I'm not a Jeffersonian, I'm a Hamiltonian. Now, Abigail Adams, what I want to know is, were the Adamses Jeffersonians or Hamiltonians? Well, Abigail just bristled and she said, sir, we were neither in favor of a republic founded on farming or on commerce. Our vision for America was that of a republic of virtue. Oh, I thought that is a humanities Chautauqua. This fellow who asked the question was entertained, and we were entertained on the stage. But it got us right to the core of the questions that we need to ask ourselves by comparing and contrasting many points of view, not buying into one until we had the evidence and the argument necessary to convince us and to convince our neighbors. And then the conversation in the tent went on. Many other people asked questions and declared what their view was and what doubts they had. And I think this was the birth of the humanities Chautauqua, not an entertainment, but entertaining ideas. If history isn't entertaining, it's not history. If philosophy is not entertaining, it's not philosophy. If literature is not entertaining, it's not good literature. So that was the start of the humanities Chautauqua.
So we've heard little bits from some of you about what came before, but tell us your memories for the three of you who weren't a part of that Great Plains Chautauqua. Tell us your memories about applying. You know, why you applied, how it felt to apply. So just share a little bit about what that entry was like.
I got something in the mail that invited me and 1,000 other people, I think, in the Modern Language Association to apply for one of the characters in the American Renaissance. And I thought not very much about it, but it turns out that there was a program in state. I was teaching in Oklahoma at the time. And for the first time, the program that George just described, the American Vision series, was going to be in a little town in southwestern Oklahoma. So my wife and I decided we'd drive down and watch that one night and see what it was like. And it was as persuasive as George suggests it was, both entertaining and educational. And so afterward, I talked to Henry Adams. And I said, what do you think it would take to be part of something like this? And he said, well, you've got to fill out, you got to write an essay, you got to do a video, you got to answer some questions. And so that started me off on a journey that lasted 2 or 3 months. I got the essay written. I got sort of a costume put together. Somebody on my faculty had agreed that they would do a videotape for me. And then I kind of bogged down. And I called Everett, I think, and said, I just don't think this is going to happen for me. I'm sorry. It's been useful. He said, no, you need to go through and finish this. So I did. And sure enough, I was fortunate enough to be named as one of those who got to travel. I didn't realize it was going to last quite so long.
Well, as I said, my professor, Professor Mark, so much in life happens with a great teacher and people who turn you on to things that you have no idea. And it was his call to me. And this conference, Culture on the Canvas, was all about actors who do historical characters. And so I went as an actor, joining the other group of actors who do historical characters. And I saw the announcement and I applied. Now, when we all gathered together in Minnesota, and I got the understanding that I also had to answer the questions as characters, I was a bit nervous for that. But George said something at that meeting that just stuck. He said, the trick of Chautauqua is the ability to stand there on stage and instead of saying the character he or the character she, you said the character I. And then once you can say the character I, then you go from there. Then you are the character. And that's what's been so intriguing about this. I had put together my first solo show in 1975. I've been doing Douglass since 75, and this was 91. But never would I have dreamed that I would ever be able to answer questions as Douglass and not from a script that I had written.
Well, when I learned about the opportunity of trying out for the Thoreau role, is there such a thing as intellectual salivation? I mean, I really look forward to trying to do that, because when I was a 16-year-old boy, I fell in love with Walden, Thoreau's masterpiece. And by the time I was 34 years old in 1991, or 1990, I thought this would be just so wonderful if I had a chance to portray Thoreau on a tour, in a tour. But what I remember the most about applying was how much fun it was and painful it was to come up with a 15-minute performance as Henry Thoreau. I thought, what in the world do I put in a 15-minute performance? Because there's so much there. There's so much wonderful material. I eventually narrowed it down to some key passages in Walden, some key passages in Civil Disobedience, and in Walking, an essay about the wild. But I couldn't resist starting the show with a few lines from an essay he wrote called Wild Apples, because Thoreau's doing some awfully clever things, suggesting to us that most of us are too domesticated. All right, we need some sourness in ourselves. We need to be wild. And so that just takes me back to how much fun I had with thinking of props even, having a crab apple to eat in the opening minutes of the show. And I also thought of, this is my final memory, I thought of a box that Thoreau mentions in Walden. He sees this box along the railroad that the railroad workers use to put their tools in it. And he makes a comment about the houses we live in, and how if we just lived in a box like that, which is about the same size a box as a coffin, by the way, just lived in that box and bore a few holes in it to let in the air, we would not be haunted by the rent we would have to pay for a box that's just a little bit larger and more luxurious. And I went to the baseball coach at our school. I had seen that they had a box where they kept equipment in. And I had to talk with the baseball coach, who was a friend of mine, about how I'd love to have that box as a prop in the theater department just for one day when I would make this tape. And I'll just never get over how much he laughed and thought, I never thought I would be giving you, Kevin, this box that would keep bats and balls in for some show to portray Thoreau. It's a wonderful memory.
So let's move into our third part, which is probably the richest part of this recording. George, is there anything else we need to know just about the background or the beginnings of the Great Plains Chautauqua before we launch into some memories?
Not very much, really. the National Endowment for the Humanities encouraged each humanities council in each state to organize programs for the public, not for schools. In fact, they were in those days forbidden to run programs in the schools. The schools already had their humanities professors and their teachers, and the government is not going to, Congress is not going to put money into more of that. That was a plenty. So the councils had to figure out some other way to do it. Well, they'd send a professor to a library, and 5 or 6 people would come. In North Dakota, it was hard to get professors to leave the eastern extreme of the state in winter and drive all the way out to some library in the western part of the state during a blizzard. In the summertime, professors would happily drive across the beautiful North Dakota and lecture in a library, but in North Dakota, people don't want to go indoors or stay indoors or be indoors in the summertime. For goodness sake, it's precious short. So the director of the Humanities Council in North Dakota decided he'd invite professors to come and talk to audiences in a tent, and people could sit outdoors. Well, there were a few more people, maybe 20 people would come, sit in the tent on a folding chair. It wasn't very comfortable, and some prof would lecture about something or other. And one day, one evening, the director said to the lecturer, he said, "Why don't you, instead of talking about Teddy Roosevelt, here, just put on this hat and pretend to be Teddy Roosevelt, talk in the first person." Well, that went very well. And the next night, the tent was full. And people enjoyed that kind of program. It began in 1976 and ran in a little tent that held maybe 50 people, crowded, through the 70s, late 70s and early 80s. And by the time I joined in 86, they were traveling a bit on the Great Plains. They had worked together, pooled money with South Dakota and Nebraska and Kansas. And then in 1988, when they were going to do American Visions on the Great Plains, they formed the Great Plains Chautauqua Society and raised money and got a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to pay humanities scholars, which was a good deal for humanities scholars to get a summer wage without having to teach terrible summer school. So in 88, we began with that 3-year program on American Visions. And when that closed after 3 years, we announced a new program for the American Renaissance. And by this time, the Great Plains Chautauqua Society was up and running and going much better than it had before, and audiences grew. In fact, one night for, I think maybe it was Thoreau, we had almost 400 people in the tent sitting all around it. And it was a good summer.
Okay, so now is your chance for the 4 of you to tell us some of your favorite memories of the tour. So what stands out in your mind? What do you remember?
It's pretty hard to think about the tour in those years without thinking about the tent. And the tent wasn't something that just appeared automatically for us to perform in. We would go into a community usually on Wednesday. On Thursday, we would meet with a group from the community. Sometimes they were school kids. Sometimes they were trustees from the local jail. A lot of times they were just, people who were interested in Chautauqua and wanted to come have ice cream. And together we would put up this 50 by 90 foot tent. Sometimes that meant driving stakes into the park water system. Sometimes it meant trying to drive them into what seemed like rocks in Jamestown, North Dakota. But the raising of the tent was a very special part of the week. And it sort of was the birth of our weekend residence with the people of those towns. And hopefully over the course of the next 5 nights, we justified their attentions and their time by trying somehow to enrich their understanding of the text that we wanted to present. So that was really important, the tent. Sometimes we put it up and never performed in it because a storm came. And sometimes we put it up and it rained, a storm came, and there was 6 inches of water underneath it. But at the end of the week, we always folded it up, put it back in the truck, and headed off to another place to put it up again.
I think weren't we in Yankton, South Dakota once? I had to perform in the Opera House, and it stormed very badly during that performance. And we went down to the tent, which was very close to the Missouri River, and realized that the storm had almost carried that tent into the Missouri River.
Into the river. Yeah.
It had pulled all of the stakes, big, long wooden stakes, out of the ground except on one end, the end closest to the river. So it had flipped the tent entirely, pulled it up, flipped it, had damaged various chairs, if I remember right, and maybe even the poles that we used for the backdrop on the stage. It was quite a shock to us all to go down there and realize how close we had come to the tent being carried in to the Missouri River. I mean, sometimes the weather was very bad and could damage the tent or make the ground awfully wet.
Where I live here in Texarkana, in Northeast Texas, is right in Tornado Alley. So it comes through Louisiana, up through Arkansas, into Texas, and up through Oklahoma, all the way to North Dakota. And I'll never forget, wherever Wild Bill Hickok's ranch is, I think it's someplace in Nebraska, they told us, it's coming, we've got to go now. People didn't want to go. It was about 50-50, and about half of us stayed, and half the people left. They opened up the barn where Bill Hickok's gear was. I stood on top of the trailer, and I did Frederick Douglass in this blazing storm where about 50% of the people stayed there to watch Frederick Douglass in this tremendous storm. That was a night I'll never forget.
If we're going to mention favorite memories, this will be quick. But I learned on that in those 3 years of traveling with you guys, that I like fried chicken way too much. I remember we had fried chicken so many times on these events that especially the nights when the tent would be set up, there would always be fried chicken. And I hate to admit this, but when the tour was over, Linda told me later, my fiance at the time, that she leaned over to her mother. They were meeting me at the airport. And she said, now be prepared because Kevin has gained a great deal of weight. And when I started that tour, I think I, weighed a certain amount. And when I finished that tour, I think I had gained almost 20 pounds in 10 weeks because I just loved that fried chicken too much.
We did eat a lot of chicken, and we did eat a lot of pizza under the tent, usually after shows. But we had some pretty good places to eat occasionally. But there were towns that we went to by the nature of this program, going to small places, where sometimes the only place to eat in town was Pizza Hut. And it was a walk. So you had your choice between spaghetti and pizza.
I remember in the touring, leaving the university and joining with all of these people and being locked in a van with them and driving for hours across the Great Plains. And I thought, what are we going to talk about? We don't come from the same institution at all. Well, we wound up talking about ideas and books and one another's characters and asking one another questions. We had a real intellectual life during the summer, better than during the school year, because if faculty got together during the school year, they'd all grumble about the president and the vice president and how the administration wasn't doing his job and, local university politics. We didn't talk university politics because we didn't care. We didn't know. But we did have a lively intellectual exchange as well as a good friendship that began to develop. So when we descended on a town, we had a bunch of ideas just to pour out on them, and they were poor, unsuspecting souls who just thought, we were old teachers.
Now, I want to ask a specific question, and that is for each of you to talk about what you think is accomplished in the best moments of Chautauqua. What kind of learning takes place? And this could be under the tent, but this could be other times while you're in that community in those 5 days.
For me, there's a certain type of potential where you see this country in all of its diversity. Let me start off with 3 incidents one afternoon in a little city in Oklahoma. I was walking from the hotel. I was going down a major street on the way to this restaurant that Carol told us to go to. And as I was walking, a couple of guys went by, a finger went up, and he said, "Leave town, nigga." I just sort of looked at him, and I just walked on into the restaurant. So I'm sitting there waiting for my meal to come. And all of a sudden I feel a presence because I'm reading. We were always reading when you went on stage. And I looked up and there's a young lady, I guess she's 17 or 18, young white girl. And she says, "Hi." I said, "Hi." She said, "You're here with the Chautauqua, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, my name is," and she introduced herself, and she said, "I saw you sitting over here, and I just wanted to come over and welcome you all here. And I'm going to come to Chautauqua every night, and I just want to thank you for coming to town." And I said, "Wow, well, thank you very much." And then she left, and I sort of meditated on that for a while, got back into my book reading, and I felt another presence about 5 minutes later. And there was a lady standing there. She was, I guess, 35 or 40 years old, white lady. And she came up and she said, "Hi." I said, "Hi." She said, "I'm sorry I wasn't there to meet you all yesterday." And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Let me introduce myself." And she gave me her name and she said, "I'm the mayor of Pumpkin City. And we want to welcome you all to town. And we are looking so much for what you all are going to give us today." And I thanked her. And so I thought of those 3 incidents that happened from one extreme to another, and the positive far outweighed the other. Also, in telling that story, there's too much interest in the other because it was just 1/3. It was more like 1/10 of 1% compared to 1,000 times with the positive. And so it just showed me the diversity, one, of the Great Plains. People in the Great Plains will often say, people speak of them as flyover territory, and it's all monocultural. I found the Great Plains, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, is not a monoculture place. It is an extremely diverse place, and I never get that when I read the books over that area when I was reading geography in school. And so that, for me, was the greatest, is the diversity that exists between northern Texas and southern Canada.
When Chautauqua works, it seems to me that what it accomplishes is that it allows people who have attended to look at the world in a new way, not just with their bare eyes, but through the characters they see. White men can look out at the world through the eyes of Frederick Douglass or Malcolm X or W.E.B. Du Bois, and they never would otherwise. If they sat down and read the book, yes, they may be able to do that. But I think when Charles presents his characters, there is an emotion that comes through that he can provide that's authentic and based on the text, but very difficult for a reader to do unless you get really into reading the author. And when Kevin does Thoreau, audience members can see Walden Pond and can see what it is that he found so fascinating there and begin to look at their own world that way. And that seems to me is one of the great accomplishments of Chautauqua. It helps us see the world through others' eyes.
Because I was offering Thoreau on the tour, I think one of the wonderful things about Thoreau is he really does very seriously question various American values. Walden is an incredible meditation upon why and how our lives can become so materialistic, so devoted to success in an American way. Thoreau perhaps is the strongest counter voice in American literature in questioning the materialism of American culture. He's also one of our most profound political voices, has inspired, especially through civil disobedience, great reformers of the 20th century, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, Desmond Tutu. He inspired the Danish resistance movement during World War II, and I could mention many others. And last but not least is what's now called the Green Thoreau, that thinker who is considered by many the father of the nature text, the father of the conservation movement. Here's a man who in the early 1850s wrote in the midst of an essay, "In wildness is the preservation," is the very core, you could argue, provides the philosophical underpinnings of what we now call the preservationist movement. It's been a tremendous privilege of me over the years to portray this important thinker in American culture, and to offer him in the tent those 3 summers was just a tremendous joy. And I've had the great privilege of doing him many times since then. But those 3 summers when I was portraying him with these good friends of mine.
In a conversation with George yesterday, I made the comment that I think when we choose characters to portray, we often look for characters who say things, think things, express themselves in ways that we wish we could and maybe don't have the courage to. And in some ways, for us as performers, being on the stage as the persona, I don't know, somehow makes us better people than we may be otherwise. And if that works, a lot of times it's that kind of genuine connection within our own minds that I think reaches out and helps to make the connection with the audience. A couple of times I remember doing Hawthorne, and at the end of the show, just being physically and emotionally exhausted, and thinking, I just don't know whether this worked or not. And then having somebody come up to me and say, wow, there were some moments there when I was really back in Salem. And that makes you happy. There were some moments, they might say, when I wasn't sure whether it was you or Will Rogers up there. And that makes you feel like the time you spent studying paid off.
I remember the night, Doug, when you did Hawthorne and the presentation went, you weren't sure how. But then you looked down in the front row, there was a woman crying. And you thought, I guess it worked tonight.
Yeah.
That's Doug's goal, right?
Oh, I remember the first time we were in Minot together in the hotel. I was standing across the room, right across from you, and we were getting down to go to the tent, and you walked out just as I was walking out. And I looked at you, and I felt your energy, and I went, that's not Doug. That was Hawthorne. I mean, that was somebody else. I mean, your Hawthorne was just incredible. It was just incredible. And it just didn't start at the tent. When you walked out of your room, you were there.
So we don't get to see full performances in this recording, but we do want to ask each of you to share with us a line or two of one of your favorites from a character, and then tell us what it is about that line that makes you choose, or those lines. It can be a couple. But what is it about those lines that make them special, make them stand out? And I'll pick on you. So we'll let Kevin go first.
Well, all right. I really have two lines that I want to stress. One I've already stressed. I didn't know I would, but I've already mentioned, in wildness is the preservation of the world. Thoreau argues elsewhere in Walden, we need the tonic of wildness. That is such a rich assertion. And that is an assertion that, at least in my reading, I know that the majority of Americans value that statement, agree with that statement. We Americans, by and large, the majority of us, value our national parks, we value our environment, we are concerned about the future of this planet. Thoreau speaks to us, even though he wrote over 150 years ago these words. But the other one is even, or just as important. As we all know, the Black Lives Matter movement is going on now. It's trying to stir the conscience of our nation. Thoreau, so long ago, in 1849, in the essay we now know as Civil Disobedience, urged the individual to consider the duties he had, or she, in relation to the state. And he argues in that essay that if we feel that the government is perpetuating injustice, if we feel that the law is such, to quote him, that it causes you to be the agent of injustice to another, then, Thoreau wrote, I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction against that machine of government that would oppress. This is the core argument, really, that rests in any nonviolent protest that takes place these days. And again, as I've said before, it's an honor whenever I get a chance to offer those words to the public, because for some, they don't know much about Thoreau. They don't know much about that essay, Civil Disobedience. And so I can, in a way, welcome them into that part of our history to help them understand that even though Thoreau wasn't a great activist, like a Martin Luther King or a Mahatma Gandhi, his pen, his writings have definitely made a difference in our world and continue to.
Kevin, it's not only that we don't know Thoreau so well, but because we don't know Thoreau, I think we don't know ourselves. I've always liked his line, I am, first of all, a man, and at a late and convenient hour, an American. What a way to hold on to America that is quite different than so many of us do. Sorry, just wanted to piggyback.
I appreciate you saying that, George. Some scholars would argue, I would argue, that Thoreau is in some ways the quintessential American.
Yes.
He is someone who is constantly in his writings and in his life questioning for what we live, why we live the way we do, what we devote our time to. I mean, the first chapter of Walden, an 18-chapter book, is called Economy. And it's the longest chapter in the book. And he meant it as a long preface, really. But he's really asking question after question, offering scenario after scenario to get his readers to question how they spend their lives. What is the economy of your day-to-day life? How are you devoting your time? And what are your ultimate aims? He's a moralist, and he's urging us to think about what's morally right, not only for our fellow human beings, but for our own selves, for our own soul. That's what I've always liked about him a great deal. He's really wants us to probe and to try to live an examined life.
So, George, what is your line?
Well, it fits with what Kevin was just talking about. Mark Twain is an American humorist. He is also an American philosopher. And his big attack in his work is on hypocrisy. He said, we condemn the spoken lie, but it's the unspoken lie, the lie that goes unsaid. As everybody knows, if you were an abolitionist, you had to work awfully hard to get people to speak up and say something about slavery. And we all knew what was wrong, but we were afraid to say anything, and that is a lie. And so he talked about all kinds of moral issues. He used to say that there's commercial morals, and there's political morals, and there's ecclesiastical morals, and then there's morals. And he criticized his fellow men constantly. Finally, he summed it all up, I think, in just a half a line when he said that man is the only animal who blushes or needs to.
Doug, what comes to mind for you with these lines?
Well, it's sort of the same theme. You know, we've talked a lot in the last few years about lying, about telling the truth. Both of the characters that I've spent most of my energy with have something to say about that. And sort of comes in the conclusion of Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, when he says, be true, be true, be true. Show freely to the world, if not your worst, at least some trait by which the worst may be inferred. So don't do the hidden lie. Be true. And Will Rogers, who was, you know, you think of Will Rogers as a humorist, but the line I almost always use as a close to the presentation, and which was very close to something he believed. He's talking about how to live the rest of your life. And he says, you know, none of us is going to be here for a long time. So get yourself some laughs. Do the best you can at whatever it is you do. And most important, live honest. Tell yourself the truth and tell the truth to others. Live your life so that when you lose, you're ahead. That's one of those things that the characters say that I wish I had said that I hope I can live by.
Okay, Charles, that brings us to you.
Well, you know, this year we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. Women got the right to vote. And of course, we trace much of organized activity back to the 1848 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, 19th and 20th of July of 48. Frederick Douglass had just started his newspaper December of 47, and he covered that meeting. He seconded Elizabeth Cady Stanton's sentiment that women should have all the rights of men, including the rights of women. And years later, Douglass, reflecting on his life as a whole, he said that I've done very little in this world in which to glory. When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. When I pled the cause of the bondsmen and the bondswomen, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of women, self went out of the question, and I felt some glory in that act, close quote. So Douglass's newspaper, the North Star, was devoted to two things. It was abolitionist newspaper, and it was a pro-woman's newspaper. And Douglass said that he would fight for those two causes for the rest of his life, if necessary, through his voice, his pen, and his vote. Of course, we are also commemorating the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, which would forbade government to deny the right to vote for anybody because of previous condition of servitude. The practical effect was all men had the right to vote. But Douglass was a person who understood that, and he had lived enough history, and he knew, as he said, that it's all about struggle. He said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. And that, for me, exemplified his life. It's all about the struggle through his pen, his voice, and his vote.
So these lines just gave anyone watching this a little sampling of what those full characters would do. And these men and many others have given so much to so many audiences over the years. But I also want to ask the question of each of you, when you left this tour, when you went back home, what did you bring with you? What did you get from this? How maybe did it change who you are or how you do other aspects of your life?
Well, for me, Charles, again, I had the greatest in respect and admiration for the two endowments that was founded, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the Smithsonian Institution, that this country felt the necessity and the need to dedicate public funds for the advancement of conversation. And as a result of those public funds, what I brought back was the most practical thing that one could bring back: money that I had made on that 10 weeks. I went in the summer of 1993 from a family of one to a family of three. And then another year to a family of four. So my wife, Yolanta, Erin, our daughter, and our youngest daughter, Diamond, and I was making $750 as a graduate instructor. So Chautauqua then allowed us to live. So it was a very practical thing happen. As a result of my teaching, both at Purdue and when I went to Center, it started to form my coursework as an assistant professor of anthropology and American studies. First of all was leaders. So I was doing all of these leaders, what I call my bodacious brothers. And I had performed these brothers, and I was able to bring my students into the process to such an extent that they wanted to know if they could do this too. And I said, indeed we can. And so I had an agreement with the drama department that I created a Chautauqua training session. So I taught a course called Cross-Cultural Performance and a drama course. And then I developed another course in terms of my area of the anthropology of performance, ritual and performance studies. And so I was letting them know that as Homo sapiens sapiens, as fully modern humans, we are hardwired to create ritual, to create performance, because we are mammals. We can't exist individually. But of course, we also have an individual will. And we struggle with that self-other split. And the thing that our species has developed to keep us together is ritual and performance. And so for me, Chautauqua was a way of applying that anthropological theory out on the Great Plains and to see what I call the connectivity effect, in this case, around ideas about who and what it means, on the one hand, to be an American, and on another hand, what it means to be human through the 7 disciplines of the humanity.
Part of what I brought back at the end of the summer were friendships with these guys and Carol Peterson and Annabelle Howard and Everett Albers that provided a sort of dimension beyond the university professor of American literature or whatever, the job that I had to do for most of the year. They showed me other ways and other places of doing a job and helped me to do mine. So that was an important part of the game. I think it also made me freer of the place where I've been for the last 30 years, largely as a faculty member, with more freedom to explore.
Doug taught at Oklahoma Baptist University. This is my final year at Anderson University. He taught, and I still do teach at a Christian university. But my role, the way I saw myself as a professor at Anderson, substantially changed as a result of my summers with the Great Plains and other summers when I traveled with other Chautauqua societies. It has broadened my mind and my experience much more so than I could have wished if that had not happened, these avenues had not happened. And it also helped me realize that perhaps one of my greatest passions in being a professor of English is to help my students when I'm teaching a literature class, help my students understand the tremendous dynamism of a voice to be found in a text, to help them hear the innuendos and the fine distinctions and the dramatic shifts, whether it's a poem or a play or a novel or a short story, because really many of my students haven't even begun to understand how to hear that. And so I can bring that to the classroom, and Chautauqua, performing as Thoreau and then eventually as two other men, have helped me to hone that skill much more so than I probably ever would have before. That I value greatly, tremendously. But I also am so grateful for how Chautauqua has taken me into avenues and places even in the world. I performed in Beijing, China once as C.S. Lewis, that I probably never would have visited otherwise. And probably what is closest to my heart, to wrap up this part of what I have to say, is eventually I wondered if I would do Thoreau long enough, if the Thoreau Society would finally recognize me. And they eventually did. And I'm so happy to know that I performed as Thoreau a total of 6 times in Concord, Massachusetts. And those performances have been especially precious to me because I admire Thoreau so much. And the very best memory of all was the second time I performed in Concord. I was part of a program that the American Antiquarian Society and the Thoreau Society, both in Massachusetts, arranged. It was a program called John Brown and New England. And they had me perform in the First Parish Church on the exact 150th anniversary of Thoreau offering his speech about John Brown in Concord, exactly 150 years later. And then 2 nights later, I performed 150 years later, as he had offered his talk again about John Brown, impassioned speech defending John Brown's actions in Boston. And then 2 nights later in Worcester, Mass. And I even used a podium, Charles, in Worcester, Mass, that they claimed Frederick Douglass had used when he had in Worcester, Mass. We all have memories like that, I'm sure. But for me to be in the First Parish Church 150 years later after the night he delivered the John Brown speech, and for them to ring the bell as Thoreau rung the bell to get the attention of the people in Concord, of all the moments I've had performing, that was the most precious for me. And my wife was there too. It was the first time she'd ever been in Concord. So fellows, that was a pretty good memory for me that night. And it never would have happened without the Great Plains. I don't think it would have happened.
At the end of the summer, my return to the classroom was a little simpler. I was so relieved to be able to go in and teach a class without having to build the room, put up a tent, set up 500 chairs. It was a piece of cake. But then I had a friend who said he was afraid I was going to suffer from multiple personality syndrome when I started to do Carl Jung, the psychologist and psychiatrist. He thought I was doing that in order to deal with my multiple personality syndrome. And I said, I don't suffer from a multiple personality syndrome. I just sit back and enjoy it. I like to hear these people talking together in my head. I do almost a dozen different characters, more than I should. And a number of them I've retired from the costumes, but not from the head. And to have those kinds of people talking to each other as you think about any given thing, it is a real blessing to be able to know people well enough so that you can hear them speaking in your head. It's a great gift that Chautauqua has given to me.
So in 1998, the Great Plains Chautauqua Society tour ended and you went your separate ways. So tell us a little bit about what you did next and how maybe you continued to keep giving back to keep this movement going.
Well, we set up the National Chautauqua Tour and chose a theme, American humorists. And we did a little touring. We started out in Delaware and went around. We didn't do it too often, but it was always good to come to a town. They always put up the tent for us and see these old friends again, and to make people laugh. Americans have a good sense of humor. And once you get them laughing, then you can spring a rather dark philosophical truth for them to consider that they would probably tar and feather a professor for saying. But if Twain says it, or if Melville says it, or if Will Rogers says it, well, then they'll think about it.
Mentor other organizations or possibly mentoring other scholars, performer scholars, so that they would keep this movement going?
Well, of course, in 98, it really didn't stop. The thematic basis, the disciplinary basis changed, and it changed from a literary focus to a history focus. So I remained with the Great Plains Chautauqua until 2007. So I was there for 4 years as Booker T. Washington, and there 5 years as York. As a matter of fact, the first Chautauquan was Dr. Jerry Tweeden. He was playing John Jacob Astor in the Behold, Conceit of Shining Sea. And I remember he was on the night before the last night, and I closed it out the very last time the tent was up, and I did the last performance in the Great Plains in the character of York. And that was an interesting experience in North Dakota. And at that point, it was over forever in terms of the Great Plains Chautauqua. But of course, what we did, there were other Chautauquas starting up. And as George said, we continued to work with these other Chautauquas, including coming to Ohio. And we just played various characters and whatever we could do that the community and the sponsors and the local committee. I can't say enough about the local committee, because that was a great revelation for me in all the communities, not just the Great Plains, but there's always, you got sort of 3 levels. You got the state council, or the people who are doing the administrative aspects of it. You have the scholars who are implementing the program, and then you have the local people in the community who puts it all together, that local community. And just working and meeting with those people and see how they are empowered through Chautauqua. And we tell these stories with them as well, because when you leave, they will be there. And if you've done your work the way you want to do your work, you know that Chautauqua will leave after you've left, because it's those local committees that keep the process going year after year after year.
It was the first site that we all did together in Altus, Oklahoma. At the end of the week, the local coordinator said, "We hate to see you guys go. We enjoyed all the programs, but if we hadn't seen a single one of them, this would have been worthwhile, because all of the planning forced people in our community that wouldn't talk to each other about a lot of other stuff came together to help plan what we put together this week. So go on and have a good time somewhere else. I think we were on our way to Tulsa. But here in Altus, we were successful before you ever got here. So Charles, you're exactly right about the local committees and the work of trying to build a community. I'm sure that didn't happen everywhere, but where it does happen, it may really be the magic of the program.
And just to throw in, to piggyback on that, I remember the week that we spent in Red Cloud, Nebraska. And Red Cloud is the home of a famous writer, Willa Cather, some of the audience members would know. Red Cloud at that time, population, I remember, was 1,200. Every night we got 600 people under the tent. And I asked the young lady who was the local coordinator, I said, how do you do it? Your town is advertised of 1,200 people and half the population is here. She thought for a while and she said, well, I guess we just realized out here, if we don't do it, it don't get done. And that was that was the attitude. If we don't do it, it doesn't get done. Yep, they did it.
Well, I'm not the most gregarious guy in the world. I'm definitely an introvert. I know that. I've taken the Myers-Briggs 3 times. But those tours, you spend one week in towns that mostly are very small in the Great Plains. And by the end of that week, you, the scholar, and many people who are interacting with each other, friendships have been formed. You come to know people by virtue of the various ways you've interacted throughout the week, by virtue of the shows, by virtue of having fried chicken together. And it's really a marvelous experience, and it really is a wonderful way for a community to hope, I think more often than not, much more often than not, the community is healing wounds, forming new webs of relationships that probably would not have formed otherwise.
Lisa, your question asked about how some ways of spreading this to other people. We haven't mentioned that in some of the communities where we performed, there were youth Chautauquas that came ahead of us, usually led by a teacher or a couple of teachers. But over the years, I think all of us have had experiences of going into communities where inviting young people, maybe 4th, 5th graders up through high school, in fact, kids who frankly didn't very often come to the tent at night to see us, had presented characters of their own, maybe with a school connection. One of the best of these that I ran across was a program, I don't even remember exactly where it was. I want to say somewhere in Colorado, where the school had everybody in the 5th grade present a character. And on a certain night, they would have a meeting in the gymnasium invite all of the parents, and the students would line up around the gymnasium in costume to prepare about a 3-minute presentation in character. And the parents' job was to go around the room, put a quarter into a box that was in front of each of these people, and when the quarter went in, the student did his or her 3 minutes. And this went on for a couple of hours. At the end of the night, they would collect the quarters and go back, and the students would decide collectively whether they would give that money to a local charity, to a regional charity, or to an international charity. And so they had kind of made a connection between doing something that they were a little surprised was fun, and also finding a way to help out beyond themselves. I think that's kind of what we all hope happens with Chautauqua. You know, you reach out and you change things beyond yourself. But I suspect some of those young people I'd like to think that eventually a few of them will end up on a Chautauqua stage somewhere.
I saw that happen one place that I know of, and that was in Greeley, Colorado. There was a young woman who had started in the 8th grade. And the year that I saw her, she had just finished university, and she portrayed great Margaret Mead. And she did an incredible job as Mead. And I now know she's done at least one other character. So I know that was at least one I saw her from an 8th grader all the way through college to now doing Chautauqua on the main stage.
Well, I think Marion Cott's daughter, Marion was the state humanities director in Kansas for several years. I think Marion's daughter, who did several characters in competition, actually won a partial college scholarship for what she did.
That's a great example of the power of Chautauqua. Do you have other things you might want to say about the power of Chautauqua to have a broader impact than just that local community?
Kevin, could you talk about what happened in China?
I had the privilege of being asked to bring my C.S. Lewis to a conference that takes place once a year in Beijing, China, at the beginning of October. It's a 4-day conference when Christian teachers who teach at various Christian schools throughout China gather, exchange ideas. And I gave 4 workshops that week. I was considered the drama guy who came from the United States, and I had various presentations to help the teachers there think about how drama performance can be incorporated into the classroom. But I was also going to be the surprise guest after the banquet the last night of the conference. Well, to portray C.S. Lewis for a crowd like that, there were 300 people there, very nice banquet was given, and very nice room, and to deliver some very powerful material offered by C.S. Lewis. About half of it's about his conversion story. He resisted believing in God throughout his 20s. He was very bitter, as most young men were, as a result of their experience during World War I. But then eventually, once he gets past that story, he offers a variety of passages that have to do with everything from prayer to grief to love to doubt and so on. Passages that would really be quite moving and important for Christians. That was an experience that I never thought I would have, and I had so many people talk with me later about how they found that so enjoyable to hear someone try to bring alive this voice of this very well-known defender of the Christian faith. And there was a couple that came up to me at the end, and they told me that the show had touched them so deeply because part of it's about a grief observed and how much C.S. Lewis struggled after his wife had died from cancer. And here was this man who was known worldwide by then as a defender of the Christian faith, and yet he writes this incredible book called A Grief Observed, when he's very, very honest about how angry he is with God and how he feels that God's not listening anymore, and how is he supposed to reconcile this loss to any sense of a benevolent God. It's a very honest text. And I render about 10, 12 minutes of that in my show. They told me that it had moved them and it had helped them in their faith to understand that even C.S. Lewis really struggled with grief because they had lost their 12-year-old son just a few months earlier when he fell through a grate in a sidewalk in Beijing, and it had killed him. There are moments like that. We probably all have moments like that when we know that somehow by being a channel, if you will, for the voice of, in this case, C.S. Lewis, it's touched someone. And I just felt like a vessel. And I'm not trying to emphasize just the Christian possibility here. I think there are all sorts of voices we depict. And those voices can touch people, can move them, can aid them, if you will, in whatever moment they're experiencing in their life. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Charles, because it was a moment in my life when I realized, this depicting of people from the past, this offering to the public some voice that should be heard, can really have some powerful moments. It really can affect the audience members. And I consider it a privilege to be able to do it.
Well, I had a similar experience about intercultural contact after 9/11. I had been doing Malcolm, first Douglass at University of Michigan in Dearborn. Dearborn, as you might know, has one of the largest Middle Eastern populations in the nation, maybe next to Detroit and Los Angeles. And they really wanted me to come back to do Malcolm. And I came back to Malcolm, and I finished the show, and I was out with a young Arab American MD and another young Arab American graduate, and Claude Jacobs, who was the head of anthropology. And we were talking, and one of the young men said to me, he said, after you're done Malcolm, we would ask, quote unquote, Malcolm's question. And then sometimes we'd switch that a little bit, and we'd ask another one. And then we switched a little bit and asked another one. And I said, how did I do? They said, you passed. I said, well, great. I said, I could tell by the way you phrased that in terms of a sense of ownership. And I said, it's very interesting. I said, because we Black Americans look upon Malcolm as a Black man who happened to be Muslim. They said, yeah, we know. He said, but we look upon Malcolm as a Muslim who happened to be Black. At that same session, I met a lady named Dr. Theodore Moser. She was a professor at the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church in New York City. And the Episcopal Church was starting some dialogue with lay ministry and the Islamic community in New York City. And so she invited me up to do Malcolm. And I did the Malcolm, and they would go out in the day. They would go to the Museum of Modern Art and look at Islamic art. We went to the International Islamic Center there. We went to the mosque that Malcolm had been a minister at. And I saw this interfaith dialogue that was happening with the Episcopal laity and the Islamic community. And it was just interesting to be a bridge builder, to talk about Malcolm as one who was both an American and as an Islamic person. And for my own purpose, to started to do the research. And of course, Islam goes all the way back to the beginning of this country, but we don't talk about that. I think I read someplace that Thomas Jefferson had a Holy Quran as a part of his bookshelf, but there's a long history of Blacks from West Africa, what was called the Gold Coast, and that was an area where the people were Islamic. So bridging that gap in a post 9/11 context showed me the potential of the Chautauqua to be what I call a KEBS, a key emergent bonding symbol. And I said Malcolm is a key emergent bonding symbol in that he is indigenous to both the Islamic community and the American and the Black American community. And they both have ownership because he was authentically both. And when you have a symbol that's authentically both in two traditions, you have an ownership, and now you have a point of contact. And then you can move the conversation however you want to move it, because you're coming from a common human source.
Mm-hmm.
So in the spirit of the humanities, we are going to end with some book recommendations from these fine scholar performers. So each person was going to bring to us a book idea and share a little bit about why they want to recommend it to you. So let's see, George, will let you begin.
Okay. When Chautauqua works, people leave the tent or the bandshell or wherever the performances take place and say, I'm going to read that book. I'm going to read that author. And I've come to say that Chautauqua is just books in costume. When we ended the Chautauqua season, we had a bunch of books we were going to read when we got back to our schools and homes. And the latest book that I have read is Marilyn Robinson's book, Jack, an easy title to to remember. It's the fourth of her books in the Gilead series. Her first book is set in the fictitious town in Iowa, Gilead. In this one, a kind of a black sheep in the pastor's family who lies and cheats and steals and is an embarrassment to his pastor father. And he finally goes to St. Louis, where he becomes a drunkard, lives out of doors or in terrible rooming houses. He still has some interest in poetry, though, and in books. And one day he sees a high school teacher drop a whole stack of books and papers in a rainstorm. He runs to pick them up and give them to her and walk her home under the umbrella. She invites him in for tea. They fall in love. She's an African-American woman and he's a white man. She is respectable. He is anything but respectable. And it's the working out of this relationship in Missouri and the end of World War I, when people of different races cannot marry. All kinds of problems in her family, because her father too is a pastor, an AME bishop, in fact, and he and church members have a hard time with this relationship. It's a fascinating book and beautifully written. Marilyn Robinson is a magnificent author and will raise all kinds of questions in the minds of any reader.
Well, I'll go because I teach Marilyn Robinson this semester in my 20th Century American class. But I don't teach Jack. I don't teach Gilead. I teach housekeeping, which was the first sort of groundbreaking work. And the students find it fascinating. They also find it puzzling at places and very dense. I think it helps a little bit to have studied the Transcendentalists to teach that book. But my recommendation actually is a biography. In 2017, the bicentennial of Thoreau's birth, this biography, Henry David Thoreau, A Life, by Laura Dassau-Walls, who teaches at Notre Dame and is a friend of mine. Laura is arguably the most prominent and important scholar of Thoreau living today. And this is an incredible biography. If I intrigued any of you watching this program about Henry David Thoreau, I recommend that you read this biography because it brings Thoreau alive in the way no other biographer has brought him alive before. It helps us understand that Thoreau was not the hermit at Walden Pond. In fact, Robert Richardson, who was married to Annie Dillard, writes this on the back of the book. In recommending this book, he writes, Walls has given us a new socially engaged Thoreau for a new era, a freedom fighter for John Brown and America, and a necessary prophet and spokesman for planet Earth. I highly recommend this biography. Sometimes I think some English majors think it's blasphemy to recommend biographies. We're supposed to always recommend fiction. But the older I get, I don't know why, but the more I enjoy a good biography. So I want to recommend this book tonight.
The book I brought along is Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. She had a book some people may know from 2 years ago called The Warmth of Other Suns, in which she traces the migration of African Americans, largely from the South to other parts of the United States. This is a book that I think she discovered, an idea that she discovered as she was beginning to do that book. And in some ways, this is more basic. Clearly, it's a book about race, but in her mind, it is not race that divides us so much as the presumptions of a social hierarchy in which race has become a determiner. And I have to confess that reading this book, and I'm back in the process of rereading now, reading it sort of changed my worldview about, I think I've been pretty conscious of racial issues since my undergraduate days at Baylor, when an ethics professor sort of pointed us in the direction of some things. I've taught African American literature. I've lived in Africa for a year. I've written about written about some African American writers, poets, and in some ways this book has put all of those things in a somewhat different perspective for me. It's not an easy book to read, and I won't say it's a book that will leave a reader necessarily optimistic at the end, but I think with a different and deeper understanding of why we don't seem to be able to get things right in this country about race, and about social order, and maybe recognizing that is an important first step in trying to fix some of it. I hope so.
I hope so too, Doug, but I think she tells wonderful stories.
She does tell.
It's not a
good
difficult
stories.
book to read in that sense. She is a good storyteller.
Yeah, in fact, I would say after I finished The Warmth of Other Suns, I said this to you yesterday, I felt almost like I'd been cheated. I wanted something more than the stories.
Yeah.
And this book does that, but the stories are clearly there, and the stories will stick you, especially white readers, I think.
I have a edited book. It's really the history of the woman suffrage movement, and it's by a friend of all of us, Dr. Sally Rush Wagner. And the foreword to this book is by Miss Gloria Steinem. And Sally is not only a scholar, an academic scholar, one of the founders of woman studies as an academic discipline, but she herself is a very fine Chautauquan. She does Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she does Jessie Benton Fremont, and she does Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And she gives you the primary sources, and you can get her ideas about how all this came to be. And so if you want one text to sort of bring it all together for you with the primary sources, The Woman Suffrage Movement by Sally Rush Wagner is my recommendation.
So you have your reading planned for a while just with these 4 recommendations. We thank you for watching this, and we ask that all those questions spinning around in your head right now, the things that they didn't talk about that you want to know about, or the details that you want them to expand on, send us those questions. Post them on Facebook, on our Facebook page. Send them to info@ashlandchautauqua.org, and you will be able to hear the answers to your questions, hopefully on November 19th. Don't forget to register for that event so that we can all gather back again on Zoom at 7 p.m. on the 19th and hear more of their stories and get your questions answered. And we've got a long list of events going all the way till next May. 5 more books for you to read, because we have a book for each of our In Times of War characters. And the scholars will be there on those Zoom meetings, leading the book discussions and getting you to think, and as George has said, ask those questions. So check out our webpage. We are www.ashlandchautauqua.org, and you can see our schedule of events that will go from November all the way till next May.